Hello, I'm Robert, fact checker and science blogger, and this is for the Facebook group Doomsday Debunked and helping people scared of many things. And this is for our members and for people generally who are Christian, could be other religions as well, and who have reasons to be very, they want to know what it means, what's this story you've probably read on the internet about claiming that vaccines are developed developed using fetuses or something. So then you can find various fact checks, and these will help put you right. But sadly, most of the fact checks are mistakes in them too. So I've looked a bit more carefully into it. So first of all, the headline thing is that the Catholic Church does say it's okay to use all the vaccines for COVID, and all the vaccines are in modern use. They're all ethically according to Catholic Church, and I think if you could look at this carefully, then you will decide it's ethical according to the Protestant churches as well in the Bible Belt, US, and in other places like Australia and so on, and probably and other religions as well, like my own Buddhist religion and so on. I think that it is ethical to use these vaccines. So that's the headline thing. And this is not just me, that's not me saying that. That is the US bishops and bioethics committees and things like that. US Catholic bishops have come out saying that very clearly. It's absolutely okay. So for many of you, you don't need to listen to the rest of this, but I will go on to explain in detail why it's okay. So I mean, if you just came here and said you're a Catholic and you want to know if it's okay, then it's already been sorted out. I've got the link down here. And so the ethical statement from the US Catholic bishops, you don't need to read far down the page to see that they're saying that it's okay. And the reasoning is, so first of all, so I'll come to that in a minute. I'll explain that. You can read that, but I'm just going to explain it. So first of all, what is the connection? So there is a connection between aborted fetuses in the 60s and 70s and medical research. So I want to explain that first, then explain why the Catholics and most other Christians say it's okay, and then I'll talk a little bit more about it. It's all quite complex, so I've got quite a lot to explain, and so please bear with me. It might take a little bit of time to explain everything. So first of all, so no vaccines are ever grown in fetal tissues. That's my number one point there. But I'm not going to read through the points. I'm going to explain carefully. They're grown in, some vaccines are grown in cells whose ancestors more than half a century ago came from a single aborted fetus. So it's important to know that fetuses were not aborted to make a vaccine, and they were aborted legally. For instance, in some cases, fetuses are aborted because it's needed to save a mother's life, and most people in most religions will accept that that's acceptable, and the baby was going to die anyway. And then in some cases, then in most of the cases that they actually use them, it's from a country where it is legal abortion is legal, and the mother decided within the legal process in that country to have an abortion, which of course is always a major decision for a mother. And but then we next look at what happens after that. So again, most mothers, they would not give their fetus to medical science, but some mothers who have a very strong medical background, medical understanding, then they will. And the way they reason is that their fetus, it's dead now, so they don't think that there's anything. It's the fetus itself is going to be affected anyway, or the living being that was in the fetus that was born as that fetus. So there's nothing to be impacted by it anymore because the fetus already died, and whatever the belief as to what happened after it died. And then they say that by donating the fetal tissue to medical research, they're helping other children, other babies. So you can think of it as being a very ethical thing to do, to donate an aborted fetus for medical research. Can even be kind of consolation for some others. Got some kind of feeling they've made something worthwhile come out of what a very sad situation. And so anyway, that's the origin of the fetuses. So then, why did this ever happen? Why? So okay, most people would accept that it's okay for some others to donate their fetuses for medical research. That's their decision, and it's okay for the doctors to use it. Just as it's okay for doctors to use the bodies of people who've died and who donate their bodies to medical science. So I think most people would accept that's ethical so far. So then, why would this ever have anything to do with vaccines? Well, the thing is that some vaccines are grown in hen's eggs. That's the flu vaccines often grown that way. And there's a very new idea that we actually got a vaccine phase 3 from Medicago, which is grown in tobacco plants. Very innovative approach. So obviously something like that's not going to have anything like this. But some vaccines need to be grown in human cells. And so if it needs to be grown in a human cell, where are you going to get hold of vast amounts of human cells in order to make all these vaccines? So that's when the clever idea in the 1960s was if you get some of this, and they actually, this is one of the mistakes. So there are many mistakes in the fact-checking that I've found on the internet. One is they nearly always say that these are cell lines of stem cells. They're not. They're cell lines generally of fibroblasts, which are cells in the connective tissue. For instance, the one that the rubella vaccine comes from, it's the fibroblasts from a 1960s abortion fetus, from the lungs of the fetus. And the researcher got 800 tiny little vials of the tissue from the lungs of that fetus from 50 years, more than that, more than half a century ago. And then this was the very first time it had ever been done, and he didn't even know it was possible, but he thought, we'll try doubling it and doubling it and doubling it and see how long it can go on for. And he found that they can double and double for a very remarkable amount of time, to 50 generations. So that's a very, so roughly 2 to the 10 is 10 cubed, so 2 to the 50 is 1,000, 1,000, 1,000, 1,000, 1,000. So that's yeah, 1,000, because that's a million billion. So beyond a billion, people don't really have very much grasp of what numbers mean, but a million billion cells from a single cell. And then from all the cells that he extracted back in 1962, then they reckon they can make 20 million metric tons of human cells just from that single fetus. Now, so if it was a stem cell, which is the other thing that I mentioned, then it could just go on infinitely, called immortal. But those weren't discovered, well, they suspected them in the 1960s, they eventually proved a bit later. The very first one actually extracted, I think it's 1988, from human blood marrow. So there's no way that they could have even used stem cells back in the 1960s. They just didn't have them from humans. They didn't have them from anything, I think, in the 1960s, that's more in the 1970s. And even into the 1980s, really to the 1980s, and then towards the end of the 1980s that it began to be something you could start thinking about, that you could have a cell line. And so I'm not even sure how recent, certainly, I mean, like, you're talking about 20, 30 years ago. I'm not sure when the very first cell lines from stem cells were established, but this is well before that. But what they did is they used the fibroblasts in the human embryos, and they're very young cells, and they're also very clean because the child hasn't grown up, it hasn't got any diseases yet, or not adult diseases, or even child diseases, and it's a very clean line, all the same DNA, all the same kind of cell, and so you have a very uniform cell line, and then you can study it and you understand very well how it works, and then you grow the vaccine in that. So the rubella vaccine in MMR, or in the MMR, most vaccines are not made in these cell lines anymore, but the rubella vaccine in the MMR vaccine does come from this cell line that I was just describing to you. There's nothing of the original fetus in the vaccine. It's just cells that grown from it, and nothing of even of the cells grown through many generations back through there to the present. There's nothing of those cells in the vaccine either, because when you make the vaccine, it destroys the cells. That's the way viruses replicate, and vaccines are made by replicating in a similar way. So it goes into the cell, and then the cell explodes, and you've just got lots and lots of vaccine, and or cell disintegrates one way or another, and then the result is then purified of everything except the vaccine. And I'm not very clear that you could expect a little bit of contamination, maybe, well, depending how the purification goes. I can't find a paper on this as to whether there could be some tiny traces of fragments of DNA. DNA is not very stable outside a cell or outside a virus. So, and I was difficult to find out if there could be any traces of DNA left in the vaccine. As I said, the fact-checking websites like Reuters, DEBUNK or whatever, they're not very scientific. They do their best, but they just said things that I could fact-check the fact-checkers, and they were incorrect. So I don't kind of accept that what they say is right on this particular topic. It's a very difficult topic for them to research. I can well understand why they made these mistakes, because it's quite subtle and difficult. Anyway, so I think there's one fact check that got it right. But it wasn't one that I could actually link. It couldn't explain everything. It just got some things right. Everything it said was right, but it was quite limited in what it was just talking about Astrazeneca, I think. Anyway, so the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines are not growing in any of the fetal cell lines, but the Astrazeneca vaccine, and most of them get this wrong, the Astrazeneca vaccine is grown in a fetal cell line. I got it wrong as well because I was relying on the fact checkers who got it wrong. And this is why the US bishops say, what they say is it's okay to use any of these vaccines, but if you have the choice between the Pfizer vaccine and the Astrazeneca vaccine, they say to go to use the Pfizer vaccine. Now that's a very rare situation. They said don't delay vaccination in order to get your preferred vaccine. So basically, if you go in to get vaccinated and that says to you, which do you want, the Pfizer vaccine or the Astrazeneca vaccine or the Moderna vaccine, then if you're Catholic, you should say the Pfizer or the Moderna vaccine, because for Catholics that's a somewhat preferable one. So I think it's not a sin for any of them, but the Catholic Church want the vaccine manufacturers to move towards using less of these cell lines from the fetuses and more of the other cell lines. Now, because the fetuses, we're not going to be getting any more cell lines from fetuses, because nowadays we'll do it using stem cells. And we can even get ordinary cells from the human body and turn them into stem cells. So there's no reason for any new cell line, but the reason they still use these old cell lines because they're very well understood and very well studied. And it might be the AstraZeneca, I don't know why AstraZeneca chose to do it this way, but it might be that for some reason this particular cell line, they already had the experiments already done to know that their adenovirus would be able to replicate very well in that particular cell line. So that would be an example of why a company would still use one of these cell lines. Because remember that it's not going to make any difference to this aborted fetus in the 1960s that you're using their cell line rather than a more modern modern cell line. So for most people who are not in the Catholic Church, then it would seem not to be very significant which cell line you use, because it's not going to impact on anyone today. And so so it's well understandable why Astrazeneca did make that decision. If I think they must have already known that for some reason they knew that the vaccine would go well in this particular cell line. Because none of them are identical, they're all different DNA, different from different fetuses, different DNA. They're not absolutely identical. There are going to be differences as to how they work. And so that's most of what I was going to explain, really, actually. So yes, I was just going to explain a little bit more. So the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines are not going in any fetal cell lines, but some fetal cell lines, because they're absolutely ubiquitous in medical research, then if you go to early medical research, there's no choice. So if you are kind of very ultra pure about this and say, I don't want to use any drugs, if there's been any medical research at any stage going back to the 1960s that contributed in any way to the knowledge that led to development of this drug, you're going to find it very difficult to find drugs that were none of the research going back and back and back to the 1960s, because remember, back then that was about the only way that you could have human cells in your laboratory. If you had to do any testing with human cells without actually testing in an actual human, then you would have had to use one of these cell lines. So it's quite difficult if you go that far and say, I don't want to be involved in any way in anything to do with medical research. You'd have to do a huge amount of research and be quite difficult to decide, and to actually, you'd have to be reading lots of complicated papers and go back and back and back to try and find out if at any point anyone doing any research had ever used one of these cell lines. So in the case of the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, then some people did do that, what I just described, going back and back, and they found that you do find. And then I think even with the modern vaccines, then the vaccine itself is not going in a fetal cell line, but some of the experiments done to check to see if the vaccine worked involved the virus, the COVID virus, grown in one of these fetal cell lines. So not the vaccine, but the virus. So you get these indirect connections. And again, the Catholic Church say, like, preferably you wouldn't have any connection, but this again is acceptable. Or remembering all the way along that these, so it's not, they say it's acceptable, but there mustn't be any, so did I explain this bit? Receiving one of the COVID-19 vaccines ought to be understood as an act of charity towards the other members of our community. And so it should be considered as an act of love to our neighbour and part of our moral responsibility for the common good. So that's why you do it. And you also do it to protect yourself as well, because they say that as well. Current pandemic and the lack of availability of alternative vaccines, the reason are sufficiently serious to justify their use, despite their remote connection to morally compromised cell lines, morally compromised from a Catholic point of view. And so, and for the Astrazeneca vaccine, then as it is made in these cell lines descended from legally aborted fetus decades ago, but the bishops said it should be avoided if there are alternatives. But it may turn out, however, that one does not really have a choice of vaccine, at least not without a lengthy delay in immunisation that may have serious consequences for one's health and the health of others. So in that situation, if delaying to get the other vaccine is going to have a consequence on your health or of others, then you should get vaccinated, if you follow the advice of these Catholic bishops, and you may well come to that same conclusion yourself. So this is the normal situation. It's not going to be very common that you go in and thus will say, do you want the Pfizer vaccine or do you want the Astrazeneca vaccine? It'll be whatever they have. So in that situation, when it's come to your risk group, just go in and get whatever vaccine they have, and then that's you vaccinated. So in other words, opt for Pfizer or Moderna, but don't delay getting vaccinated. The only choice is the Astrazeneca vaccine. That is, I mean, unless you knew that you were totally no risk. So, I mean, if I was a Catholic, which I'm not, so these particular considerations don't apply to me. For a Buddhist, I think just going back and knowing that what you're doing has no connection with is not going to change anything about the fetus back in the 1960s. So, if you're thinking like that, then you don't feel there's any connection here with your doing anything that's going to harm the life of any living creature because it died already decades ago. So for Buddhists, there isn't really anything to think about here in any of this. Because you're thinking about the direct consequences of your actions. And those are the consequences of other people's actions that have already been done decades ago. So I don't think there's any, if you're Buddhist, I don't think there's anything really to think about here. But for Catholics, then you do have something to think about. So, so the fact that the connection is remote in these circumstances can be morally justified according to Catholic ideas of how sin works. So, yes, so I was going to say something else. Oh yes, this bit I was going to say. We must be on guard so that new COVID-19 vaccines do not desensitize us or weaken our determination to oppose the evil of abortion itself and the subsequent use of fetal cells in research. So it's not about starting new cell lines from fetuses. That's not happening anymore. But they, from a Catholic point of view, they want to get rid of the use of fetal cell lines in medical research. They want us to be moving in that direction. So they're trying to influence researchers to move away from these fetal cell lines. But it's going, for instance, the Astrazeneca, we've had the phase 3 trials. The phase 3 trials were of a vaccine was made using a particular very individual fetal cell line. So it has been proved to be safe for the vaccine developed in that way using that particular cell line. So if you're going to use a different cell line, you would have to go the same process, go through the same process of proving it is still safe. And or at least you would have to investigate whether you can change the cell line and what impact having a different cell line would have on, and whether you need to redo the phase 3 or whether you need to redo anything. So I'm no expert, I don't know how much you'd have to redo, but you would certainly have to consider whether using a different cell line could have any impact on the results of your phase 3 studies, and your phase 1 and phase 2. So it's not as simple as just slotting it down and saying, okay, we want to make AstraZeneca with a different cell line, because they would have had good reasons for choosing this particular cell line. So I'd just like to say that I'm not an expert on any of this. All that I have is that I'm very used to researching into chasing up sources and citations and double checking very carefully, because as I said, so most fact checkers say that these are stem cells, which they're not. Most of the fact checkers I saw said that AstraZeneca was not grown in a fetal cell line, and it is. These were the two major mistakes that I found in most of the fact checking stories that I found. And then most of them didn't go into any level of detail like I've been doing about how it all works. And none of them actually quoted from the Catholic bishops or the Catholic not almost none of them. I think one or two might have done actually. No, I'm not sure. One of them maybe. Can't remember now. But that's a report from the Catholic bioethicists, and this is the general thing about, for instance, rubella and mumps vaccines. In a 2005 study, the Pontifical Academy for Life said Catholics have a responsibility to push for the creation of morally just alternative vaccines, but it also said they should not sacrifice the common good of public health because there's no substitute. In other words, if there's no substitute, you shouldn't sacrifice the common good of public health by refusing to get your child vaccinated for the MMR vaccine. And Catholics can have confidence if there's a great need and there are no alternatives, they're not forbidden from using these new vaccines. There's much the Church calls us for doing, seeking out alternatives, that's part of that, and advocating for alternatives. That's the name of the cell line, HEK293. So if you want to find fact checks that get it right, have a search for HEK293 in Astrazeneca, and that gets up if any of the fact checks. I think this one got that much right. But oh yes, it's a Reuters one. It got most of it right. This was one of the best ones, but it was very confusing, somewhat confusingly written. You could read all the way through and still not realise that the Astrazeneca vaccine was actually made in a fetal cell line, because it was just very technical, and then it wasn't very clear, I thought, in how it was written. It didn't make it clear. Even with technical background, I had to go and look in other sources to find out whether the vaccine itself was made in such a cell line. Yeah, so I've already said this. There's no aborted fetus in anyone. This is a video by a scientist who's pretty good, so that's a very short introduction to it. It's very, very good. It doesn't go into the details I just did. I've got some other links here. 1960s. It's about the history of it. Somewhere down here, detailed history. So yes, so it's the Salk and Sabin polio vaccines. Yes, I didn't explain that. I don't think. Hope I didn't repeat myself. SP40 was a virus from monkeys, because originally they were grown in cell lines from monkeys, but one of them gave laboratory hamsters lethal cancers, and the regulators were concerned about this. Sorry, they didn't give humans lethal cancers, they gave laboratory hamsters lethal cancers, and there was concern about whether this virus could affect humans as well, whether it could cause cancer. So then Leonard Hayflick had the idea of getting cells from one fetus, make sure they're clean, and then use that to make the viral vaccines from then on. And so then it would be safe from any contamination of viruses or anything else. Yeah. Yes, the first culture of embryonic stem cells from mice is in 1982. And that's the stem cells. Oh, sorry, so this is a bit unclear. Each of the original fetal tissue line stem cells, the fibroblasts, stem cells, they can reduce 40 to 50 times and produce 20 metric tons of human cells. But and that's a little bit about the Swedish woman who was the origin of who donated that fetus in 1962. And yes, the first. So and then it's 1988 before you have the blood marrow, I think. So anyway, yes, these are just all the people involved now. It happened, and yeah, that's it. That's it. I think I've explained everything now. So hopefully that's just to clear what the situation is, and then it's for you to decide based on that information what, according to your own beliefs and convictions, then what the ethics is for your particular religious views. And so I just wanted to make it clear, because most of the fact checks I found just didn't make this clear. There are several things they missed out. And this, as far as I know, this is an accurate description of what the situation is. And then it's for you to decide what you make of this, and what your own personal decision is if you're a Catholic. And then many Catholics will just say, well, that's the decision, that they've already looked into it. I don't need to look into it myself, because it's already been looked into by people who understand it all very well. But if you do want to look into it, then I've given you the information you need, and lots of links that you can follow up to find out more. You can read the statements and find out a little bit more about all the things that I've talked about. And so, and do say if you have any questions about any of this, and or anything else, do join our group if you want to help with fact checking things like I'm doing just now. And we very much welcome people who are able to do this sort of thing, or who have the specialist knowledge in particular areas. So in my case, I've got no specialist knowledge in any of this. Didn't have a clue about it until I started researching it. I knew what stem cells were, and I didn't know. I believed the fact checks, because I just hadn't thought through about, you know, when did we first have isolate and prepare cultures of stem cells, and when are these fetuses from, and you know, it's only when I started searching up and I thought that doesn't make sense, and no, there's something wrong here, and so I followed it up, and then I found out what the true situation is, and that's it. And there's a very detailed it's a very detailed history. Yeah, that was a good one. It was actually in National Geographic, which has got rather kind of clickbaity recently, but that was a good one from 2017. It's actually an interview of a book. Someone was writing a book about it, and I thought it was pretty good, so I've included that. You can find out an awful lot more detail than I've gone into about some of the the strange history of vaccines, and about, you know, some of these things I'm talking about. So, okay, I'll upload this and hope this will be useful to some of you. Yeah. Oh, if any of you join the Facebook group on the Doomsday Debunk group on Facebook, either because you're scared or to help other people, then if you don't need this obviously for reading it, but if you want to go into post, please just have a look at because of the special nature of the group, we've actually got quite a lot of rules that help it to work properly, and they make a very big difference to the functioning of the group, and it's the reason why it functions reasonably well, is because of all these rules. So I'll just have a glance at them. Most of them but will be things that are very easy to comply with, but you know, it's the nature of the group and the nature of the very scared people we help there, and we have to be very careful, and so we have quite a few rules that it's worth having a look at before you do your first posts, to help people in the group. Although you get a pretty good idea about how other people respond and what they say, but just be aware of the rules at the head of the group, and maybe have a look at them, especially the first few.